You need one thing: a bottle of aspirin, a gallon of milk, a stamp. So you get in your car. You back out of the driveway. You drive past a few streets of houses that look more or less like your house. You reach a road that's wider than the rest. You pass a gas station. Then a fast food restaurant. Then another gas station. Then a strip of stores set back from the road behind a long expanse of parking lot. You find the pharmacy. You park. You walk across the asphalt. You buy the aspirin. You walk back. You drive home. The whole trip takes 20 minutes for one item. And it's so normal that you almost certainly didn't think about it at all. But here is the question worth asking. Why is the pharmacy over there, separated from everything else by a parking lot and a road designed for a car? Why isn't it next door, or across the street, or on the ground floor of the building where you live? Why does buying one thing in America require getting into a machine? The answer isn't geography. Other countries with similar climates, similar population densities, and similar incomes don't work this way. The answer isn't culture. Americans didn't always live like this. The answer is a law. A specific, named, dateable law that most Americans have never heard of, passed by a city committee in New York in the summer of 1916 to solve a problem that had nothing to do with pharmacies or parking lots or the way towns across the country would eventually be built. The committee was trying to stop a skyscraper from blocking sunlight. What they created instead was the invisible framework behind almost every American street you have ever driven down. The rule they wrote in 1916 was never supposed to leave New York. What happened next is the reason your town looks the way it does. Chapter 1. How American towns actually worked. Before the law arrived, American towns were built around a simple principle. People needed to reach things. And since most people walked, things needed to be close. The typical American town of the late 19th century was not divided into neat categories. A street could contain almost anything. A family might live above a bakery. A tailor shop might sit beside an apartment building. A small hardware store might occupy the corner between two rows of homes. A blacksmith's workshop might operate a few doors down from a church. This wasn't disorder. It was logic. The logic of proximity. When your feet are your only reliable transportation, distance has a real cost. Every block between your home and the butcher shop is a block you have to walk in winter, in rain, carrying whatever you bought. So towns organized themselves to reduce that distance. The things people needed most were placed where people already were. A typical American in 1880 could complete most of the tasks of daily life within a quarter-mile of home. The grocery, the doctor, the school, the church, the employer. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough that the neighborhood itself functioned as a nearly self-sufficient system. By the early 1900s, electric streetcars had begun extending that radius. Wealthier residents could travel farther to work. Early suburbs developed along streetcar lines, stretching outward from city centers in long corridors. But those suburbs remained connected. A streetcar brought you downtown. Downtown still had the stores, the offices, the energy of commercial life. The city and the neighborhood were not yet separated from each other. They were two scales of the same thing. But by the early years of the 20th century, something was changing in American cities that nobody had designed and nobody fully controlled. And nowhere was the change more dramatic or more visible than in New York. If you're enjoying the video, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. Chapter 2. The City That Grew Too Fast. At the turn of the century, New York was becoming one of the largest urban concentrations on Earth. Millions of people. An island running out of horizontal space. Land so valuable that the only rational direction for buildings was up. The skyscraper age had arrived, and it brought with it a problem that nobody had anticipated. In 1915, a building was completed at 120 Broadway in Lower Manhattan, the Equitable Building, 38 stories. It rose straight from the sidewalk with no stepbacks, no setbacks, no concession to the street below. and it cast a shadow, a 7-acre shadow, over the surrounding neighborhood at certain hours of the day. Streets that had received direct sunlight went dark. Office workers in nearby buildings lost their light. The problem was immediate and physical. You could stand on the street and feel it. The equitable building became a symbol, not because it was uniquely terrible, but because it made visible what unregulated vertical construction could do to an urban street. If one building could create a 7-acre shadow, what would 10 buildings do? What would 50? But the sunlight problem was only half the story. Several blocks to the north, a different kind of conflict was developing. Fifth Avenue, the city's most prestigious retail corridor, lined with department stores and luxury shops, was facing pressure from the garment industry expanding up from the Lower East Side. Garment factories and their workers, many of them Jewish and Eastern European immigrants, were moving into buildings near the avenue. The wealthy merchants of Fifth Avenue did not want them there. In 1916, the Fifth Avenue Association lobbied the city aggressively. They wanted a legal mechanism to control what happened near their stores. They wanted separation. They wanted the ability to say, the garment district belongs over there and not here. So New York had two problems simultaneously: skyscrapers blocking sunlight, and a class-driven campaign to control who worked where. The solution to both would come from the same document. The city turned to a Brooklyn lawyer named Edward Bassett. He had spent his career thinking about cities, about transit, about how urban space was organized and who it served, and he was about to coin a word that would permanently enter the American vocabulary. Chapter 3. Edward Bassett. And the word he invented. Edward Bassett was not a famous man. He is not a famous man now. There is no monument to him, no statue, no building that bears his name in the way that architects and industrialists sometimes get their names attached to things. But the word he coined in 1913, while chairing the New York City Committee on the Height, Size, and Arrangement of Buildings, entered American law and never left it. The word was zoning. It seems obvious now. Of course you would call it that. But before Bassett used it in its modern planning sense, the idea of formally dividing a city into zones with legally enforceable rules about what could be built where and what could not did not exist in a comprehensive form anywhere in the United States. On the 25th of July 1916, New York City adopted the resolution. Bassett's committee had spent 3 years drafting. It was the first comprehensive zoning resolution in American history. What it actually said was this: the entire city, all 5 boroughs, 301 square miles, was divided into districts. Use districts determined what activities were permitted: residential, commercial, or unrestricted. Height districts controlled how tall buildings could rise. Area districts governed how much of a lot a building could occupy. The famous setback requirements forced skyscrapers to step back from the street as they climbed. The higher a building rose, the more it had to angle away from the property line. This is why so many Manhattan buildings from the 1920s and 1930s have that distinctive wedding cake silhouette, stepped, tiered, narrowing as they reach toward the sky. That shape was not an aesthetic choice. It was a legal requirement born from the shadow cast by one building on Broadway. The 1916 resolution worked, in the sense that it solved the immediate problems it was designed to address. Skyscrapers became less likely to create unbroken street canyons of shadow. Industrial uses could be steered away from certain areas. Neighborhoods gained a degree of predictability. But the deeper idea behind the resolution, the idea that a city should be formally divided into zones with different rules for different areas, and that the uses permitted in those zones should be separated from each other, had now entered the world. And it was about to find a far more powerful advocate than a city planning committee. The man who would take zoning from New York and offer it to the entire country was not a planner. He was an engineer, an industrialist, and a future president. And he believed that standardization could solve almost any problem, including the problem of how American cities should grow. Chapter 4. Herbert Hoover's Template. Herbert Hoover became Secretary of Commerce in 1921 under President Warren Harding. He was, at that point in his career, one of the most admired men in America, a self-made engineer who had organized food relief for millions of Europeans after World War I. Competent, systematic, relentlessly modern. Hoover believed that the federal government could improve American life not by commanding people, but by providing them with better information and better models. Standardized parts made manufacturing more efficient. Standardized practices could make cities more efficient. The role of the government was to develop the standard and distribute it. In 1922, he convened the Advisory Committee on Zoning. Edward Bassett was a member. The committee spent 2 years producing a document that would, without anyone fully anticipating it, reshape the physical form of every city and town in America. In 1924, the U.S. Department of Commerce published the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. It is important to understand exactly what this document was and was not. It was not a federal law. It could not compel any state, any city, or any town to do anything. No one was required to adopt it. No penalty existed for ignoring it. It was a template, a model framework, a suggested system that states could use when writing their own zoning authority, the legal power they would then pass down to cities and counties. And Hoover's Commerce Department didn't simply publish it and wait. They distributed it actively. Copies went to state legislatures, planning commissions, city councils, and local governments across the country. Hoover treated it as a modernization project, the same philosophy he applied to industrial standards, applied now to the design of cities. The response was extraordinary. Within 6 years of the SZEA's publication, 35 states had adopted zoning-enabling legislation based substantially on the template. By 1930, approximately 800 American cities had zoning ordinances, a concept that had existed in exactly one city in 1916 had become the standard operating procedure for urban development across the country in less than a decade and a half. But the legal framework still needed one more thing before it could become truly permanent. It needed the Supreme Court. In 1926, a small suburb north of Cleveland, Ohio called Euclid had adopted a zoning ordinance following the SZEE model. A real estate developer named Ambler Realty challenged it in federal court, arguing that zoning amounted to an unconstitutional taking of property. Their land, they claimed, had dropped in value from $10,000 per acre to $2,500 per acre, the moment the zoning rules restricted what they could build on it. The lower court agreed with them. Zoning, the district judge ruled, was unconstitutional. The case went to the Supreme Court. And here, history nearly went a different direction. The justices initially appeared inclined to affirm the lower court's ruling. Then a Cincinnati planning attorney named Alfred Bettman filed an amicus brief, an unsolicited legal argument from an outside party making the case for zoning's constitutionality. Legal historians have credited that brief with influencing the court's eventual decision. On the 22nd of November 1926, the Supreme Court upheld zoning 6-3. The decision is known as Village of Euclid v. Ambler Realty, and the type of zoning it blessed single-use separation zoning, where homes, stores, and factories are placed in distinct, legally separated districts, has been known ever since as Euclidean zoning, named not after the ancient Greek mathematician. Named after a small Ohio suburb that most Americans have never visited and few have heard of, the framework was now constitutional. The template was already spreading, and a country that had spent centuries organizing itself around the logic of proximity was about to be reorganized around the logic of separation. By 1930, the legal foundation was in place. But the full consequences of that foundation wouldn't become visible for another 2 decades. They needed one more ingredient. It was already sitting in millions of American garages. If you want to discover more hidden stories behind the world around us, subscribe to the channel. Chapter 5. The car and the law find each other. The automobile did not cause zoning. and zoning did not cause the automobile. But when they found each other, they produced something neither could have created alone. The Standard State Zoning Enabling Act was published in 1924. At that point, the majority of Americans still did not own cars. The mass adoption of automobile ownership was still a decade away. Zoning, in its early years, spread through a country that was still organized primarily around walking and transit, which means that when the law decided homes and stores should be separated, it made that decision before the car had fully arrived to make the separation livable. The car came anyway. Through the 1920s and 1930s, ownership climbed. By the post-war years, it had become standard. And what the car did was remove the physical constraint that had kept American towns compact for centuries. Before the car, distance was expensive. Every block between your home and the store cost you time and effort that you didn't always have. Towns were compact because they had to be. The neighborhood was dense because density served people on foot. The car made distance cheap. Suddenly, living miles from work was practical. A store didn't need to be nearby, it needed to be reachable. And since everyone was driving, reachable meant connected by a road, not located within walking distance. Zoning and the car reinforced each other perfectly. Zoning said, "Homes belong here, stores belong there, factories belong somewhere else." The car said, "That's fine, I can cover the distance between them." Zoning created the separated landscape. The car made it function. And once the car made it function, the separated landscape became the assumed model for every new development. Then came a detail that locked the system in place more thoroughly than either zoning or the car had done alone: parking minimums. Beginning in the 1950s, zoning codes across America began including requirements specifying how many parking spaces a business had to provide for its customers. The specific numbers were largely derived from observations at a handful of existing buildings. What was the peak parking demand at this store, on this day, and then encoded into law nationwide with minimal additional research. A typical commercial zoning code required 4 to 5 parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet of retail space. Work that out in physical terms, and it means the parking lot serving a store is often larger than the store itself. Sometimes much larger. And here is the consequence that changed the geometry of American commercial life permanently. If a business must provide a large parking lot, that parking lot has to go somewhere. It typically goes between the street and the building. The building gets pushed back from the street. The sidewalk, if it exists at all, is now separated from the store entrance by 100 feet of asphalt. The building faces the parking lot, not the street. The street becomes a road, a thing you drive on to reach the parking lot, rather than a place you walk along to reach the store. The traditional storefront, the kind that put a shop window at eye level on a sidewalk, became nearly impossible to build legally in most American commercial zones. Not because anyone decided storefronts were bad. Because the parking math made them impractical, and the zoning code had quietly made them illegal. With zoning providing the legal framework, the car providing the mobility, and parking minimums reshaping the geometry of every commercial block, America was ready for the largest building boom in its history. And the suburbs that rose from that boom would make the separated city permanent in concrete and asphalt for 100 years. Chapter 6. The Post-War Suburb and the Separated City. When 16 million American veterans came home after World War II, they needed somewhere to live. They needed it immediately. The country had a backlog of housing demand that had been building since the Depression and deepening through 4 years of wartime construction restrictions. Developers responded at a scale American construction had never previously attempted. New neighborhoods appeared outside cities with extraordinary speed. Entire communities were built from scratch in months. And the framework those communities were built within was the one that zoning had established. Residential here, commercial there, industrial elsewhere. The logic seemed sound. Why place a factory next to a family's home? Why run heavy delivery trucks through a quiet neighborhood? The separation of uses had a genuine rationale, and in the urgency of post-war construction, nobody stopped to ask what the long-term cost of applying it universally might be. The GI Bill provided the financial engine. Federal mortgage guarantees made homeownership accessible to millions of families who had never imagined it within reach. Developers applied industrial construction methods, assembly line building, pre-cut materials, standardized designs, and produced homes faster and cheaper than the market had ever seen. And in 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act authorized 41,000 miles of interstate highway. The system made commuting viable at distances that had previously been impractical. A worker could now live 20 miles from his office and consider that a reasonable arrangement. The highway connected the separated zones that zoning had created. The daily routine that emerged from this combination was new in American history, though it quickly became so familiar that it stopped feeling new at all. Wake up in the residential zone. Drive through the residential zone. Exit onto the highway. Arrive at the commercial or industrial zone where work happens. Return in the evening. Stop at the commercial strip for groceries on the way home. Between 1950 and 1980, the urban land area of the United States grew by 300%. The urban population during that same period grew by 60%. The difference between those two numbers is sprawl. America was not simply growing. It was spreading, thinning itself across the landscape in a pattern that made every destination farther from every other destination, and made the car the only practical way to connect them. The suburb offered real things: space, quiet, homeownership, a yard. These were not illusions, but the design attached to those real things came with a cost that took decades to fully calculate. And the place where that cost became most visible was somewhere most Americans passed through every day without thinking much about it. Chapter 7. The Death of Main Street. For most of American history, the commercial street was a place, not a destination you drove to, a place you were already in. The typical Main Street of the early 20th century put businesses directly on the sidewalk, storefronts at eye level, windows you could look through while walking past, a bakery beside a hardware store, beside a pharmacy, beside a restaurant, beside a bank. You walked from one to the next. The street itself was the connective tissue. The post-war commercial strip was something different. It was a row of stores set back from the road, a large parking lot in front, each business accessible primarily by car, each store a destination you drove to, rather than a place you passed through. The street in front was a road, a high-speed connector between one parking lot and the next. The man who built the first enclosed shopping mall in America understood the problem he was solving and spent the rest of his life regretting how the solution was applied. Victor Gruen was an Austrian architect who had come to America in 1938. He believed the American suburb was missing something that European cities took for granted, a place where community life happened. A covered space, climate-controlled and accessible by car, that could function as a town center for people who no longer had a walkable town center. He designed Southdale Center in Edina, Minnesota, which opened in 1956 as the first fully enclosed shopping mall in the United States. He imagined it with apartments, offices, a school, a medical center, a genuine mixed-use community hub under one roof. What he got was a mall surrounded by parking lots, stripped of everything except retail, replicated across the country as a commercial formula, with no civic dimension whatsoever. Gruen spent his later years publicly disowning what had been done with his idea. He called the developments that copied his design bastardizations. He said he refused to take responsibility for them. He returned to Europe. He died in 1980. Having watched his concept become the dominant commercial form of American suburbia, applied in a way that produced exactly the isolation and disconnection he had hoped to solve. By the 1970s, downtowns across America were in visible decline. Department stores followed their customers to the suburbs. Anchor tenants left downtown buildings. Storefronts went vacant. Historic commercial blocks were demolished for parking. The pedestrian traffic that had made downtown retail viable disappeared because the pedestrians themselves had moved to neighborhoods where walking was not how daily life worked. The strip mall became the commercial landscape of American suburbia. By the early 21st century, approximately 70,000 strip malls existed in the United States, each one a product of the same formula: separated commercial zone, mandatory parking, buildings set back from the street, no relationship between the store and the sidewalk. Each one a physical expression of the logic encoded in the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act of 1924. The strip mall was the commercial consequence of separated zoning, but there was another consequence: quieter, harder to measure, and in many ways more personal. The separated city didn't just change where people shopped. It changed how much of their lives they spent simply getting from one place to another. Chapter 8. The Hidden Tax on American Time. There is a cost to the separated city that doesn't appear on any tax bill. It shows up in time. The average American household in the years before the pandemic spent approximately 293 hours per year inside a vehicle, not commuting specifically. Total driving time, errands, school pickup, grocery runs, medical appointments, the accumulated minutes of a life organized around the assumption that every destination requires a car. 293 hours is more than 7 full 40-hour work weeks every year. For a person who lives into their 80s, that's years of their life spent behind a wheel, moving between destinations that the law decided could not be placed near each other. And the burden of the separated city is not distributed equally. A teenager in a suburban neighborhood has no practical way to reach a part-time job, a friend's house, or a library without a ride from an adult. The independence that previous generations of young people exercised by walking or taking a streetcar is simply unavailable. The environment doesn't permit it. An elderly person who can no longer drive safely faces a choice that previous generations did not face in the same way: surrender independence, or continue driving past the point when it is wise to do so. Because in a neighborhood designed around car access, losing the ability to drive means losing access to food, medicine, and social contact simultaneously. A family without a reliable car, or without the income to maintain one, faces daily obstacles in navigating a landscape that was designed with car ownership assumed, not as a luxury, as a baseline requirement. Approximately 23 million Americans live in what planners call food deserts, areas where the nearest grocery store is more than a mile away and public transportation is limited or non-existent. The food desert is not primarily a product of poverty. It is a product of design, zoning that separates commercial uses from residential areas, combined with parking minimums that make small neighborhood grocery stores economically impractical, produces landscapes where food access requires a car. Approximately 75% of residential land in American cities is zoned exclusively for single-family homes. That figure means that in most of the country, it is illegal to build an apartment above a store, a small cafe on a residential corner, or a neighborhood pharmacy within walking distance of the people who would use it. Not impossible. Illegal. The law that was designed in 1916 to stop a skyscraper from blocking sunlight has, in its century of application, made it a crime in most of America to build the kind of neighborhood where you could walk to buy aspirin. For most of the 20th century, these costs were absorbed as normal, as the price of modern life, as simply how things were. But by the 1970s and 1980s, a small number of architects, planners, and researchers were beginning to look at the landscape America had built and asking whether it actually served the people who lived in it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for more. Chapter 9. The People Who Noticed. The neighborhoods that Americans seemed to love most were the ones that zoning had made hardest to build. This irony was not lost on everyone. When people in the 1970s and 1980s described their ideal place to live, they often described something that sounded like an old downtown, or a pre-war neighborhood, or a small town built before the automobile had fully arrived. Walkable, mixed, Streets with things on them. Places where daily life happened without requiring an itinerary and a full tank of gas. The places they described, almost without exception, had been built before modern Euclidean zoning became dominant. In 1981, two architects named Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater Zyberk designed a community in the Florida Panhandle called Seaside. It was a small development, a few hundred homes, but it was built as a direct argument against the prevailing logic of American planning. Seaside had streets designed for pedestrians, not just cars. Homes close to the road, with front porches facing the sidewalk. A town center with shops and restaurants within walking distance. A variety of housing types mixed together. Public spaces that encouraged people to linger. Everything about it violated the principles of conventional suburban zoning, and it became one of the most imitated and discussed communities in American architecture. The movement Duany and Plater Zyberk helped launch New Urbanism argued that the problem with American cities was not a lack of planning. It was a century of the wrong kind of planning. Planning that had optimized for separation when it should have optimized for connection. In 2004, a UCLA planning professor named Donald Shoup published a book called The High Cost of Free Parking. It documented, in rigorous academic detail, something that urban observers had been noting informally for years: parking minimums. Those requirements that businesses provide a minimum number of car spaces had fundamentally distorted American commercial development. Shoup showed that most parking minimums had been set with almost no empirical basis. The specific ratios of spaces per square foot had been derived from peak observations at a handful of existing buildings and then applied universally, with the consequence that most commercial areas in America were legally required to devote enormous amounts of land to a used car storage that served only a fraction of potential visitors at any given time. The parking lot, in Shoup's analysis, was not a free amenity. It was a hidden tax on every building around it, pushing them apart, eliminating the density that makes walking viable, and encoding car dependency into the physical structure of every commercial district in the country. The research was clarifying. The critique was sharp. And recognition, it turned out, was only the beginning. Knowing what the problem is and being able to fix it are different things. A zoning code can change overnight. A landscape takes generations. But something was beginning to shift, slowly, unevenly, and in ways that nobody in 1916 could have imagined. Chapter 10. The law begins to change. For most of the 20th century, zoning reform was a niche concern. Planners discussed it. Academics wrote about it. Architects built demonstrations of what was possible, but the political conditions for broad change were not present. Zoning, whatever its systemic effects, was locally popular. Homeowners in residential zones liked the protection it gave them, the predictability it offered, the assurance that nothing unexpected could be built next door. Challenging zoning meant challenging something that millions of Americans had organized their financial lives around the value of a single-family home in a single-family zone. What changed the political equation was housing cost. By the 2010s, housing affordability had become a crisis visible enough that it could no longer be absorbed as background noise. Cities where jobs concentrated had become cities where ordinary workers could not afford to live. The reason, in substantial part, was supply. And the reason supply was constrained was zoning. When 75% of residential land allows only single-family homes, the math of housing construction becomes very difficult. You cannot build more homes near the places where people want to live, because the law prohibits building anything other than single-family homes on most available land. Prices rise because the supply cannot grow. This was an argument that found unexpected allies across the political spectrum. Conservatives who opposed government regulation found it in their framework to oppose zoning restrictions. Progressives who supported housing access found it in their framework to oppose exclusionary single-family zoning. The Coalition for Reform, when it finally formed, was ideologically unusual. In 2019, Minneapolis became the first major American city to eliminate single-family-only zoning citywide. Duplexes and triplexes were now permitted on any residential lot. That same year, the state of Oregon passed a law extending similar permissions statewide. In 2021, California passed legislation dramatically reducing single-family zoning restrictions across the state, the largest state economy in the country with the most severe housing affordability crisis. By 2023, Montana, Florida, and several other states had passed significant zoning reform laws. The movement had become genuinely national and genuinely bipartisan. The law that Herbert Hoover's Commerce Department had distributed as a template in 1924 was beginning to be revised. Not uniformly, not quickly, not without resistance. But the revision had begun. The harder question was the one that no zoning reform could answer directly. What do you do about the landscape that a century of zoning has already built? You can change the rules overnight. You cannot change the highway overnight. You cannot move the strip mall. You cannot rebuild the suburb. The physical environment created by 100 years of Euclidean zoning will outlast any zoning reform by generations. Roads exist. Parking lots exist. Subdivisions exist. The geometry of separation is already there, built into the asphalt and concrete of virtually every American community. The law changed slowly. The landscape changes slower still. Which brings us back to the beginning, back to the errand, back to the car in the driveway and the pharmacy 10 minutes away. Because the story of American zoning is not ultimately about maps or regulations or planning theory. It's about the world those things created, the world that most Americans simply accept as the world. Chapter 11: The Invisible Rule and the World It Made. Edward Bassett coined a word in 1916. Herbert Hoover distributed a template in 1924. The Supreme Court blessed it in 1926. And for the next century, the separated city became so normal that most of the people living inside it forgot it had been designed at all. This is the real power of the accidental law. Not that it imposed something obviously foreign on American life, but that it became American life so thoroughly, so quickly, and with such physical permanence that it stopped being visible. It became the background, the given, the way things simply are. The pharmacy is 10 minutes away not because pharmacies are naturally located 10 minutes away from people. They are 10 minutes away because a zoning code in your town descended from a template published by the Department of Commerce in 1924, which descended from a New York City resolution in 1916, specifies that commercial uses and residential uses must be separated, and the pharmacy is commercial, and your home is residential, and so there is distance between them, and a road between them, and a parking lot at the end of that road, and the assumption built into every feature of that landscape that you arrived by car. The corner store disappeared, not because Americans stopped wanting neighborhood stores. It disappeared because zoning made it illegal to rebuild one in most residential neighborhoods. And once the old stores that had been grandfathered in were eventually torn down or converted, there was no legal path to replace them. Main Street declined not because people stopped wanting places to walk. It declined because the commercial activity that had sustained it moved to commercial zones designed for cars, and the pedestrian traffic that had made it viable went with them. The car became a necessity, not because Americans are uniquely attached to driving. It became a necessity because the landscape was redesigned around the assumption that everyone would drive, and then that assumption was encoded into law, and then the law produced a landscape that made the assumption true. These are not natural features of modern life. They are decisions, specific, historical, legal decisions made by specific people in specific moments. A New York committee in 1916, a Commerce Department template in 1924, a Supreme Court ruling in 1926, and then 1,000 city councils and county planning boards adopting variations on the same model for the next 100 years. The strange thing about those decisions is that almost none of the people who made them were trying to produce the world they produced. Edward Bassett was trying to control skyscrapers. Herbert Hoover was trying to modernize city planning. The post-war developers were trying to build homes for veterans. The parking engineers were trying to make sure customers could park. Nobody was trying to create a country where a teenager can't independently reach a library, or an elderly person loses their autonomy when they lose their license, or a family in a car-free household lives a mile from the nearest grocery store. But intention and consequence are not the same thing. The law that nobody meant to spread beyond New York spread to every state in America in less than a decade. The template that nobody meant to be permanent became the foundation of virtually every community built in the second half of the 20th century. The idea that homes and stores and workplaces should be separate became so deeply embedded in American law, finance, engineering, and physical space that changing it now is the work of generations rather than committees. There is no monument to the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act, no historical marker on the street where the 1916 resolution was drafted, no statue of Edward Bassett in a public park. But look at the street outside your window, the distance between your home and the nearest store, the parking lot that sits between you and the pharmacy, the road that carries you to the grocery store in a car rather than the sidewalk that would carry you on foot. That is the monument. It is everywhere. And it started with a building blocking sunlight on a street in Manhattan in 1916, a problem so local that nobody thought the solution would travel. It traveled to every town in America, and you can see it from your driveway